Beloved by millions, feared by few, and misunderstood by almost everyone, Christopher Walken has spent a lifetime hiding behind a voice the world thought it knew. The pauses, the stare, the rhythm of his speech became legend. But behind that unforgettable presence was a man carrying secrets so heavy they nearly crushed him. Tonight, we step into the silence between his words, where the real story has always lived. Before he became the haunting figure in films that shaped Hollywood history, before the Academy Award and the cult-like fascination with his voice, Christopher Walken was simply Ronald Walken, a quiet boy growing up in Queens, New York. His mother, Rosalie, was determined that her sons would not live ordinary lives. She believed in the spotlight with a kind of religious devotion. To her, fame was salvation. To him, it was obligation. As a child, he didn't dream of acting. He drifted into it. At just a few years old, he was already appearing on television variety shows, standing under blinding lights, before he even understood what performance meant. While other children were learning how to play, he was learning how to stand still and wait for applause. The camera became a familiar presence long before he understood privacy. And in that early surrender to the stage, something inside him quietly closed. In interviews decades later, he would speak about his childhood with an eerie calm. No visible bitterness, no dramatic confessions. But those who knew him say he rarely spoke about what it cost him. Fame before identity is a strange thing. It builds a mask before the face is fully formed. By his teenage years, he was studying dance with intensity that bordered on obsession. He trained in musical theater, immersed himself in choreography, and carried himself with a physical discipline that would later define his screen presence. Yet there was always a loneliness beneath it. He once said he was never afraid of performing, but he was often afraid of being known. Hollywood would eventually take notice, but not in the way most young actors imagine. Christopher Walken didn't rise as a charming leading man. He rose as something darker, something unpredictable. When he appeared in The Deer Hunter alongside Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep, audiences were stunned. His portrayal of a traumatized soldier shattered expectations. It wasn't performance, it felt like exposure. When he accepted the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, he appeared almost detached, as if the celebration belonged to someone else. Behind that triumph, though, there was unease. The industry began to see him as strange, unsettling, almost otherworldly. Directors wanted his intensity, but few asked about the emotional cost. He became typecast as villains, unstable men, shadowy figures lurking at the edges of stories. While actors like Al Pacino and Robert De Niro built legacies as complex protagonists, Walken was often handed the darkness without the redemption. And then came the tragedy that would follow him like a ghost for decades. In 1981, while filming Brainstorm with Natalie Wood, Christopher Walken found himself at the center of one of Hollywood's most haunting mysteries. The night Natalie Wood drowned off the coast of Catalina Island remains one of the most discussed and dissected tragedies in entertainment history. Walken was aboard the yacht with Wood and her husband Robert Wagner. The details have been revisited for years. Accusations, rumors, reopened investigations. And through it all, Christopher Walken remained mostly silent. He was never charged. He was never formally accused of wrongdoing. But silence can be louder than confession. To this day, he rarely speaks about that night. When asked, his answers are brief, distant, almost mechanical. Some say it is guilt, others say it is trauma. What is undeniable is that something shifted in him after that incident. The lightness he once carried vanished. Friends noticed he became more withdrawn. Interviews grew shorter. Laughter became rarer. The man known for his unpredictable humor now carried a heaviness that cameras could not hide. He returned to work quickly, as actors often do, but those close to him sensed that he was not the same. The industry did not wait for healing. Hollywood never does. Scripts continued to arrive. Roles continued to demand that unsettling intensity. Directors leaned into his mystique. Quentin Tarantino later cast him in Pulp Fiction, giving him a monologue that would become iconic. That speech, delivered with chilling calm, cemented his place in pop culture forever. But even as audiences applauded, few understood the depth of sorrow he carried into every performance. He married casting director Georgianne Thone in 1969, long before the scandal, long before the Oscar. Their marriage would become one of Hollywood's quietest and most enduring unions. No children, no flashy red carpet drama, just a partnership that survived whispers and storms. Some say she became his anchor. Others believe she was the only person who truly knew what haunted him. Christopher Walken has often said he prefers solitude. He has no computer, no cell phone for many years. He avoids the constant noise of modern life. In an era where actors chase relevance, he retreated into privacy. Was it eccentricity, or was it a shield? Over the years, there were rumors of health scares, exhaustion, moments where the weight of decades seemed visible in his eyes. He never publicly confirmed serious illness, but those who watched closely saw the slowing pace, the guarded posture. Aging in Hollywood is cruel, especially for men who built careers on intensity. The body softens, the voice trembles, and yet, he continued. Behind every role, there was a man who learned early how to perform before he learned how to prose. S. Payne, a man who witnessed one of Hollywood's most mysterious tragedies and chose silence over spectacle. A man whose pauses became legendary, perhaps because they held more truth than the words themselves. As the years moved forward, the world saw Christopher Walken as an icon, a meme, a master of oddity. But icons are often prisons. The character the audience loves can slowly replace the human being underneath. And somewhere beneath the applause and the myth, there remained that quiet boy from Queens, still standing under the lights, still waiting for the noise to end. The years after the tragedy did not bring clarity. They brought distance. Christopher Walken returned to work with a discipline that bordered on self-punishment. Film after film, character after character, he immersed himself in roles that required him to disappear into fractured minds. In The Dead Zone, he carried the burden of a man cursed with visions of disaster. In At Close Range, opposite Sean Penn, he became a father so cold and calculating that audiences felt physically unsettled. It was as if Hollywood had decided that his pain was cinematic gold. Those who worked with him often described him as polite, precise, almost eerily calm. He rarely raised his voice, rarely socialized after shooting. He would arrive on set prepared, deliver something unforgettable, and then retreat to quiet isolation. Some mistook it for arrogance, others sensed fragility. There was always the feeling that he was protecting something fragile inside himself, something he could not afford to expose. The shadow of Natalie Wood never fully faded. Every few years, the case would resurface. Headlines would whisper his name again. Robert Wagner would deny, investigators would speculate, and the public would dissect old photographs, old interviews, old body language. Through it all, Walken remained composed. He did not see sympathy. He did not defend himself aggressively. He answered questions with a kind of controlled detachment that frustrated reporters and fueled suspicion. Fueled suspicion. Silence can be many things. It can be guilt, it can be grief, or it can be survival. Friends quietly admitted that he struggled during that period more than he ever allowed publicly. There were nights he would not sleep, moments when sudden noises unsettled him. The ocean, once romantic and cinematic, became something darker in his memory. He never described that night in detail. But those closest to him say the trauma was real, not necessarily guilt, but shock, the suddenness of loss, the cold, irreversible finality of it. Hollywood, however, does not pause for emotional repair. Directors like Tim Burton recognized something unique in him. In Sleepy Hollow, he embodied menace without speaking a word. In Batman Returns, his corporate villain Max Schreck was charming and ruthless all at once. He leaned into the persona the world had assigned him. The strange cadence of his voice became his trademark. Comedians imitated him. Late-night hosts invited him to read mundane lines because even grocery lists sounded ominous when delivered in his rhythm. But the myth of Christopher Walken began to overshadow the man. He once confessed in a rare, vulnerable moment that he never watches his own films. He does the work and then moves on. Perhaps it was a way of refusing to relive what each performance cost him emotionally. Acting for him was not vanity. It was labor, emotional excavation, and sometimes that excavation left wounds. His marriage to Georgianne remained steady through the noise. They lived quietly in Connecticut, far from Hollywood parties. She continued working in casting, building her own respected career, while he avoided the spotlight when not required. They chose not to have children, a decision that has long intrigued fans. Some speculate it was personal preference. Others believe he feared bringing a child into a life so unpredictable. In Intivites reviews, he once hinted that his career consumed him completely. Perhaps there was no room for anything else. As he aged, something subtle changed in the way audiences perceived him. The once terrifying intensity began to feel almost endearing. Younger generations discovered him through viral clips and comedy sketches. He hosted Saturday Night Live multiple times, delivering performances that blurred the line between parody and genius. But beneath the laughter, there was still that distance in his eyes. Working with actors like Leonardo DiCaprio, Tom Hanks, and later appearing in films like Catch Me If You Can, he showed unexpected warmth. In that role, he played a flawed but loving father, a man desperate not to lose his son. Many viewers felt it was one of his most human performances. Some critics quietly wondered if he was channeling something deeply personal. Regret, perhaps, or longing. There were whispers in Hollywood about his health in the early 2000s. Nothing confirmed. No dramatic hospitalizations, just subtle signs. Fatigue on long shoots, a need for fewer projects at a time. He never addressed it publicly. In an industry obsessed with youth, admitting vulnerability can feel like career suicide. So he continued working, choosing roles carefully, often favoring smaller parts that allowed him to preserve his energy. As time passed, the mystery around him grew. He rarely engaged in political discussions, rarely attended industry feuds. He existed almost outside the usual Hollywood ecosystem. While figures like Jack Nicholson embraced the spotlight's decadence and others like Dustin Hoffman navigated controversy, Walken maintained his quiet separation. It made him fascinating. It also made him unknowable. And perhaps that was intentional. Those closest to him say he carries deep loyalty, that he remembers every crew member's name, that he thanks lighting technicians personally, but they also say he can retreat into silence without warning, as if overwhelmed by invisible memories. The industry sees the persona. The colleagues see the discipline. Only a very small circle has glimpsed the weight he carries. The tragedy of Natalie Wood resurfaced again decades later when investigators reopened the case. Walken was named as a person of interest, though not a suspect. The language itself was enough to reopen old wounds. For a man who had built a life of quiet dignity, seeing his name attached once more to suspicion was a heavy blow. He declined to comment extensively. Some interpreted it as indifference. Those who understood him saw exhaustion. Imagine living for decades knowing that one night in your life will always define part of your public identity. No matter how many performances, no matter how many awards, no matter how many years pass. In private, friends say he has spoken about the unpredictability of fate, how a single moment can fracture a lifetime. He does not blame, he does not accuse, he simply acknowledges that some events leave permanent echoes. As the camera lenses aged with him, the world began to see vulnerability in his face that had once been hidden. Wrinkles softened the menace. His voice, still rhythmic, carried traces of fragility. He remained professional, sharp, witty in interviews, but the energy shifted. He was no longer the enigmatic outsider. He was a survivor of decades in an industry that devours most.